It's 7 o'clock. Let's get our stuff started. Welcome, everyone. So glad to have you with us, and welcome to those who are watching us on our live stream. It's always good to have an unseen audience that's a part of our coalition here. I'm Rabbi Michael Kahana, Senior Rabbi here at Congregation Beth Israel, this is an event that is part of our Adult Education Committee, and a really interesting year that we have been exploring the ideas of First Amendment free speech and some of its extremes and limitations. And whenever we want to talk about extremes and limitations, it's good to have Ron Silver to be our presenter, because nobody's more extreme. It has more to say and always very interesting. So I think everybody here probably does know Ron. We'll get a formal introduction in a moment. But if anyone who might by chance be hearing a presentation of his for the first time, you're in for a very special treat. It's always interesting, informative, and exciting. Great thank you to our Adult Education Committee for putting this together with our chair, Susan Milstein, and I'm going to invite her to come up right now and introduce our guest.
Thank you. So welcome also, everyone. The overarching theme for our programs this year is free speech and nonconformity. And we began with Professor Erwin Chemerinsky. I think a lot of you were here when he spoke. And the title of his talk was The Meaning of Free Speech in Politically Polarized Time. And one of the key takeaways was that our Bill of Rights gives us the right for free speech, but it keeps the government from constraining what we can say as individuals. So this evening, what we're going to learn about is what happens when free speech collides with history, with deeply held emotions and beliefs. And as our speaker, Ron, he's a member of our congregation. He was the chief of the Civil Division for the U.S. Attorney's Office for 7 years. And then in his last year there, he was senior counsel for community engagement. Since retiring, Ron has been leading trips to Alabama and Mississippi for both students and adults. And in fact, he just came back from a trip to Mississippi with high school students from our congregation. And Ron sings, but not tonight. Come on up, Ron.
Thank you.
So thank you all for being here, and for, I guess, up there. Thank you for being here. This should be an interesting night. We'll see who I end up ticking off before the night's over. And I want to thank Tracy Alphonse, who's going to be working my slides for me. And with that, why don't we go ahead and do the first slide, Tracy? So a little bit about me and the Nazis, because at some point you're going to get the impression tonight that I'm actually going to advocate for the concept that Nazis have rights. So I thought I should give you a little background. That is not me. That is my mother in Berlin in 1919 with my grandfather, Grandpa Bruno, and my grandmother, Mama Lily. They got divorced about 5 years after that photograph was taken and went different ways. But they both left Germany. My grandmother in 1933, she makes it to England. And when she's in England, she actually is able to get all of our family out, and also saves well over 100 school-age children that she gets placed in jobs or in schools or homes in London. And I have a photograph there of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles, because that's where all of her papers are from that rescue operation. If you ever go down to Los Angeles, you can ask for the Lily Phillip file. You can learn about my grandmother, because they make it She and my mother make it to the United States in 1939. My grandfather, he remarries to a Gentile woman, Lotta, my step-grandmother, and they float all around Europe and trying to get one step ahead of the Nazis. And then finally, in 1939, just before the war breaks out, after having left Czechoslovakia, and then they were in I think, Holland, they couldn't get to America because the State Department said they were undesirable because the Nazi government would not acknowledge my grandfather's good character, which they didn't particularly do for a lot of Jews, which is why a lot of them didn't get into this country. But Trujillo, the dictator of the Dominican Republic, thought, well, some Jews might be good for my country. So he lets several Jews in, including my grandfather. He became a successful businessman, and for over 30 years, he was the Israeli consul general to the Dominican Republic. And when I lived in Washington, D.C., and he'd come visit, it was cool because I could park in the Diplomat parking lot at National Airport, which was kind of a cool thing. So I really have no love for Nazis. They were very disruptive of my family, to say the least. But let's go to the next slide. So we're going to talk about free speech. And this is a photograph of Louis Brandeis, our first Jewish justice on the United States Supreme Court. And I say my cousin, sort of, because one of the first people my grandmother rescued was her baby sister, my great aunt Blanche, who settled in New York, and after Justice Brandeis had died, married one of his cousins. And my father didn't tell me this until after I graduated from law school. I mean, I could have used that vibe, trust me. First-year contracts, that would have helped. I didn't learn about it until after law school. But this is what Louis Brandeis had to say on this subject, and I think it's a good framework for us to think about. Those who won our independence believed that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth, that without free speech and assembly, discussion would be futile. The greatest menace to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of the American government. They recognized the risks to which all human institutions are subject, but they knew that order cannot be secured merely through fear of punishment for its infraction, that it is hazardous to discourage thought, hope, and imagination, that fear breeds repression, that repression breeds hate, that hate menaces stable government, that the path of safety lies in the opportunity to discuss freely supposed grievances and proposed remedies, and that the fitting remedy for evil counsels is good ones. So that's a good framework for approaching our discussion today. And with that, Tracy, let's get the next slide. So when I had to, it's been a long time since I took con law, 1977 with Professor J. Rex Dibble, one of my favorite professors in law school, but a long time. So a few years ago at a garage sale or something, I picked up a treatise on con law just to have it in my house. And I went back to look at it, and I was quite pleased to realize it had been written by our speaker, Erwin Chemerinsky. Now this is old, but it was helpful. But this is just my show and tell prop. So I did consult with Professor Chemerinsky. Let's go ahead. And so these are some phrases that you're going to hear me talking about what gets in the way of the government trying to limit free speech. And some of the things that people will use when they go to court to try to stop the court from stopping them are some of these terms. And the first two are this notion of when Congress or a city council or a state government passes a law that's meant to limit speech, it's just vague. I mean, it's like we don't want speech that's going to make people feel bad. Well, okay, that's pretty vague, and you'll see later why I use that example. Or it's overbroad. No hate speech allowed. Okay, What's hate? What encompasses that phrase hate? It's a pretty wide concept. And we're going to see how that's going to trip up some stuff. Prior restraints and injunctions. A prior restraint is the idea is we're going to pass a law so that don't even think about saying that. And pretty consistently, what the Supreme Court has said is unless you're talking about when my older son's in the Navy, he's on the USS Abraham Lincoln down in San Diego. If the Abraham Lincoln was about to set sail, or a comparable troop ship was about to set sail into a war zone, a newspaper could be enjoined from saying what the sailing date was and where it was headed and what longitude and latitude it can be found by an enemy submarine. You're not allowed to do that. That's about the extent of where the Supreme Court says you can make a prior restraint. And that's what happened in the Pentagon Papers case. The Supreme Court said, no, you cannot stop the Washington Post from publishing this. Now, you may put them all in jail after they publish it, but you can't stop them from doing it. And that's the concept of prior restraint. Injunctions, when I teach my middle school and high school students about all the injunctions that were imposed on the civil rights movement, and they kind of look at me quizzically like, what's an injunction? I said, well, you got to get your inner Diana Ross and the Supremes thing going. Here's an injunction: stop in the name of law. You see, I did get some singing in. That's an injunction. Stop. You can't do that. And as we'll see in the course of this conversation, watch out if you wish for injunctions, because sometimes they can the side you like may be the side getting enjoined. And then restrictions based on content. There are, governments can say, this park over here, nobody can be in that park after 10 o'clock at night because everybody's entitled to sleep in the neighborhood. That's not based on what anybody's saying. But if a court says, or if a city says, nobody who advocates free love can be in that park after 10 o'clock, but everybody who is a Puritan, they can stick around till 1 in the morning, that's based on content. You're going to have to treat the Puritans and the free lovers alike. And that's this concept of content-based discrimination that governments can't do. And we're going to see how that's going to play out into our Charlottesville story. Okay, let's go to the next slide.
You didn't mention fighting words.
I'm sorry, what?
Fighting words. You didn't mention that.
Yeah. Okay. Fighting words. Oh, thank you, Rabbi. Yes. I couldn't understand in your thing on it. Fighting words. Yeah, fighting words. The idea, there was some Supreme Court cases early on. The famous one is the Chaplinsky case. You remember Chaplinsky from law school, Kevin? No, okay. But the idea is sometimes, if somebody throws a punch at you, now you can throw a punch back. But it's possible that somebody could say something to you that is so offensive and is so manifesting a threat that they can punch you back, and so we can stop you from, you can't say those words in that scenario. But what happened is people, and I'm going to have to clean this up for my location, but politicians were starting to say that political speech essentially had become fighting words and justified an action. And the most famous case in the Supreme Court happened during the Vietnam War when a free thinker was walking around, I can't remember what city, but he had on a jacket, and on the back of it said, F, fill in the blank, the draft. And he was arrested, and the justification was, well, those were fighting words. Those would have you know, there might have been a veteran or a soldier in the crowd or somebody whose son was over in Vietnam, and if they saw that, they were going to punch him out, and we got to stop it, so we had to arrest him. The Supreme Court, no, that's political speech. And as Professor Chemerinsky has said in here, the Supreme Court has never overturned Chaplinsky, they just have never followed it. And so those are the concepts of fighting words, and we're going to see very much how that's going to play out in the Skokie case. So let's go ahead and keep going. All right, so now we get to Skokie. This is my Dave Chappelle moment. I stand with the Blues Brothers. I hate Illinois Nazis. All right, hopefully I bought some time now. All right. This guy on the left is an Illinois Nazi. And I use the Blues Brothers because the Skokie case is what inspires the Blues Brothers portion that deals with the Nazis. This guy in the middle here is Frank Collin. And let me see can I see what the next slide is, Tracy?
That's Dan Aykroyd behind him.
Say what? Go back.
Dan Aykroyd standing right behind him.
Right, it does look like that, all right. Let's go back to let's go to the next slide. All right. Okay. The curious case of Frank Collin. The old expression is you can't make this stuff up. Frank Collin was, he was a Nazi. He was an acolyte of a guy named George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the big Nazi when I was a teenager, who gets himself killed by a fellow Nazi. And then the Nazi party splits up. And Frank Collin wants to be the head of the Nazis, but he's pushed aside. So he goes starts his own little Nazi group. So here's the deal about why Frank Collin gets pushed aside. His father immigrated to the United States from Germany. His father's name was Cohen. His father was Jewish. Marries a nice Catholic girl, and they have their child, and Frank, the father, by the time the father has gotten married, in order to just kind of pass in America, he changes his name from Cohen to Collin. It was not an uncommon experience for a refugee from Europe. And somebody interviewed Frank Collin's grandmother, and her response was, I don't know where he gets this stuff. But he became a very rabid Nazi. And so he starts this splinter group in Chicago, and he wants to parade around in his Nazi regalia. There's about 40 to 50 of them, max, on a good day, usually about 20 to 30 of them. And he's parading in Chicago, in Marquette Park, which we'll talk about, and you know, he's generating a lot of ill will because Marquette Park is between a white part of town and a black part of town on the south side. And finally, Chicago gets fed up with it, and it says, you've got to post a bond before we're going to let you parade in your little uniform again. And he doesn't have the money for a bond. Nobody's going to give a Nazi a bond. And so that's going to frustrate him. Let's see what the next slide says. Yeah, so a little bit about Marquette Park, where he's doing these marches. Unfortunately, you can't read the signs. Those are some very angry white people on the top who don't like the black people on the side. That's Martin Luther King ducking his head. In 1966, Dr. King came to Chicago, and he came to the South Side because he wanted to bring his drive for freedom up north. And he goes south side of Chicago, and he really wanted to fight all the housing discrimination going on in Chicago. And so he starts pushing for integration of the east side of Marquette Park, which was the white side. And those are the white folks on the east side who are protesting. This is a photograph of just after Dr. King has been hit by a rock in the parade that they were doing in the march. And interestingly enough, Dr. King said there were only two places in the United States where he was afraid for his life. The first was in Marquette Park in Chicago, and we're going to do a little digression here. If you do the next slide, Tracy. This is a shameless promo for our Martin Luther King celebration. The second place that he felt afraid for his life was in the city of Philadelphia, Mississippi, when he went there to support the anniversary of the death of the 3 civil rights workers. And our speaker on January 13th is from Philadelphia, Mississippi, and is one of the people who put the murderer of those 3 civil rights workers in jail. So that's Marquette Park. It's a place of great controversy. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So what happens is when Collin doesn't have the money for this outrageously expensive bond that the city of Chicago wants, he comes up with an alternative plan. He's going to take his little, 30-odd ducklings from the Nazi Party, and he sends out letters to about 20 of the different little suburbs of Chicago and says, we're coming to march. And 19 of those 20 suburbs put it in the circular file. But one of those suburbs is Skokie. And Skokie has a different reaction because Skokie is unique. It had a population of about 70,000 people. 40,000 were Jewish. And of those 40,000 Jews in the city of Skokie, somewhere between 6,000 to 8,000 were actual Holocaust survivors. Not the children of, not the descendants of, they were Holocaust survivors. And this notion of the Nazis might be coming to my town, there was no way they were going to just turn away. Had they done that, it's just as likely that Collin probably wouldn't have marched there, just like he hadn't marched in the other places, or wouldn't have tried. But they took the bait, if you will. And they started to confront this notion of the Nazis coming. And they go into court to try to get an injunction against the Nazis from marching in their town. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, we talked about why Skokie was different. Go ahead, next town. No, go ahead. So what, if you're a Nazi, where are you going to go for help if people are going after you? You're going to get a good Jewish lawyer. That's what you're going to do. And that's what Frank Collin does. He goes to the American Civil Liberties Union, and he basically has 2 complaints. One, the city of Chicago is making us pay a bond to march in Marquette Park, and Skokie is trying to get an injunction from us. All we want to do is walk into Skokie, march for about a half an hour, and carry a sign that says Nazis have rights too, and that's all we want to do. And from a legal standpoint, as the ACLU later described it, Goldberger described it, and his boss in New York described it, that's a slam dunk case. That is, yes, Nazis have First Amendment rights. They get to march. If you're going to try to get an injunction against them for the content of what they're going to say, that's a prior restraint. It's a content issue. And there's just no way that's consistent with the First Amendment. And the position of the ACLU is our named client is the Nazi Party, but our real client is the Bill of Rights. And so the ACLU, which had already actually been fighting the bond requirement on behalf of the NAACP with respect to Marquette Park, says, all right, they said we don't need to add the Nazis for the fight on Marquette Park, but because of the injunction that Skokie is seeking, all right, we'll represent the Nazis. And David Goldberger basically has his life threatened. His family's got to move out of the house. It's going to be a living hell for him for about a year. But he would say, my client's the Bill of Rights. So let's go on to the next slide. So what we now have is the Battle of Skokie. You know, I'm living in Los Angeles at the time. Actually, I was probably living in Washington, D.C. at the time. This was big news. It's going to end up being a movie with Brian Dennehy, Eli Wallach, and Danny Kaye. We'll talk about Danny Kaye's character in a second. But it was a national event for this little town of 70,000 people where they rose up against the idea of the Nazis coming. And what's important to understand is they didn't rise up from the standpoint of, if you come to our town, we're going to march against you, we're going to harass you. No, we're going to use every means we can to keep you out of our town. The very concept of you coming into our town violates our humanity, and we're going to stop it. And that effort is what's going to ultimately be found to be violating the First Amendment rights of the Nazis. So let's go to the next slide. And this is where, again, what I'm going to do is we're going to do some occasional sidebars about, you know, whose ox is being gored? How can this actually, you know, if you're liberal-minded, how can we see that this is actually a very dangerous precedent to try to be using it? And what we're going to talk about now is Selma, Alabama. This man on the left was James Hare. He was the judge for a 4-county area, including the county that Selma was in. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was trying to advocate for this really astounding concept that black people should be allowed to vote. In Dallas County, where James Hare was the judge, it was essentially, no, they can't. Out of 15,000 people that should have been eligible, 150 were actually registered. And so they had a Freedom Day in 1963, and you can see people holding up signs saying register to vote, and they get arrested for that. And that's in October of 1963. They come back in July of 1964, and they try it again. And that, just the concept that they're going to come back every year, that's too much. So what Judge Hare does is he issues an injunction. And it's an injunction against any organization that talks to more than 2 people at one time about voting rights. Hard to have a movement if you can't talk to 2 people at the same time. And that injunction stays in place. The Department of Justice immediately goes into federal court to get it overturned, and that federal judge in Mobile, Alabama sits on it for 6 months. And so there is no civil rights movement in Selma for 6 months because of an injunction, because somebody felt threatened to their very core. And I want you to appreciate the legitimacy of how that felt to the white population of Selma. They were threatened to their core by what SNCC was trying to do. And so they got an injunction. Was their feeling threatened as self-righteous as the ones in Skokie? To them it was. So watch out for injunctions. Let's go to the next slide. So the ACLU loses in the state court in Illinois. They immediately appeal to the Illinois Court of Appeals, then they appeal to the Illinois Supreme Court. They will not overturn the stay. So they go to the U.S. Supreme Court. This is still my all-time favorite photograph of the U.S. Supreme Court. It's pre-female, but this was a casual photo of the 9 justices. And the ACLU goes to them, and in a 2-page decision, 5-4, the Supreme Court says to the Illinois courts, come on, what are you thinking? That's the legal term. Come on! And so the injunction is lifted. Now let's go to the next slide. But Skokie's on fire. You know, interestingly enough, when the city went and sought the injunction way back when, their lawyers had told them, don't do this. We're not going to win. But the city council said, no, we're doing it. And so they brought the injunction, they won in the state court. Of course, they lose in the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court. But all this is taking time. And while this is going on, Skokie is just on fire, and it stays on fire. You've got the Crack Jewish Defense League. You can see the JDL on their helmets there in the middle. And what Skokie does is it passes a series of 3 ordinances. And let's see, let's go to the next slide. It should be about the ordinances. Okay, yeah. What happens is this fellow on the right, Saul Goldstein, who was a big macher in the Chicago area, resident of Skokie, Holocaust survivor from Lithuania, lost his entire family. He hides out in the forest, joins the partisans in Lithuania. I mean, he's the real deal in terms of a Holocaust survivor. He and the Danny Kaye character from the movie is kind of loosely based on Saul Goldstein. And he just isn't going to give this up. And so the city council, while the case is going through the courts, passes 3 ordinances just in case as a backup. So, Tracy, next slide. Here we go with the bonds again. If you're going to march, you're going to have a $350,000 insurance bond. You can't wear any uniforms if you march in our town. And you can't have any literature that promotes group hatred. So, all designed to keep the Nazis from marching, and if they march, they're going to look like you and me in their street clothes, and they can't pass out any Nazi literature. So let's think about what might have been the problem with it. Well, we know basically the insurance bond is equivalent to a prior restraint. And so, because, again, who's going to give a bond to the Nazis? Who's going to give a $350,000 bond to the NAACP if they want to march with the idea that, that they're going to be, the bondholder is going to have to pay off on the bond if some white yahoos break up the march and destroy some property? They're not going to give the NAACP a bond. They're not going to give the Nazis a bond. Let's go to this next slide about uniforms. Ironically, this is a group of Jewish veterans, some in their uniforms or forms of uniform. While all this was going on, a Jewish veterans organization wanted to march in Skokie, and they could not march because of this ordinance. Let's go to the next slide. What promotes hate? We are living in that era right now. This was Governor DeSantis when he signed the Anti-Woke Act. He said, in Florida, we are taking a stand against the state-sanctioned racism that is critical race theory. We won't allow Florida tax dollars to be spent teaching kids to hate our country or each other. So that's what hate is in Florida. Except about a week or so ago, a federal judge said, it was a cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13, and the powers in charge of Florida's public university system have declared the state the unfettered authority to muzzle its professors in the name of freedom. This is positively dystopian, and he did away with that portion of the act. This is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. But again, it's this notion of what's hate. The state of Oklahoma has made it illegal to teach anything that's going to make a kid feel bad about themselves. That's going to go to the Supreme Court. And so this notion, again, of overbroad, vague, and is this really what the state's meant to be? Does this live up to Louis Brandeis's concept? And so, of course the Nazis teach hate. Who's going to deny that? But, where do you go? So let's go to our next slide. And here's the one I just love. This is just in the news. Former director of the Central Intelligence Agency was recently asked, which person in the world threatens America the most? And they had the choice choosing between Vladimir Putin, the premier of Communist China, the current leader of the Taliban, the gentleman on the right who's the leader of Iran. But instead, the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency said that the single most threatening person to America right now is Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers. It gives you pause to think about what role might happen if that person might be in charge of the government, if that's who they think is the person most threatening. And they're the most threatening because they are teaching our children to hate America and hate each other. So it's a slippery slope is all I'm suggesting. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the issue of fighting words. Saul Goldstein also brings his own lawsuit against Frank Collin. And the theory of his lawsuit is to a Holocaust survivor, a swastika does two things. One, it's a fighting word in and of itself, because at one point, Saul Goldstein is asked, if you were to see, during the injunction hearing, he was asked, if you see Frank Collin and he's wearing a swastika, are you going to be able to keep yourself from hitting him? And he said, I don't know. The other question is, his other assertion was that seeing the swastika in and of itself created emotional harm. That seems inherently reasonable to me. I mean, it pretty much did that for my mother, and she got out of Germany in 1933. To someone who's a Holocaust survivor, I don't doubt for a moment the truth of the statement that a swastika might create emotional harm. But what the court had to wrestle with is, with respect to fighting words, does a Nazi not get to march because you can't keep yourself from hitting him? And with respect to the emotional harm of seeing the swastika, the court has to wrestle with, given the truth of that, the Nazi does have a First Amendment right to express themselves and to use political symbols in that process. You have a choice of where you get to be at any given time. And you don't have to be there for the march. You know where the march is going to be, and that's going to be your choice ultimately whether to be there or not. Let's go to the next slide. So again, what lessons might we take from the civil rights movement around this notion of just your presence enough makes me want to smash you in, and so because of that, you don't get to have your right. So I picked this, there's all kinds of different mugshots. I picked this one selfishly because it has three of the Freedom Riders who've come and spoken at our congregation. You've got Dave Dennis on the top, second from the left, Dr. C.T. Vivian on the middle row on the right, and of course John Lewis on the bottom on the right. So this is the Beth Israel Freedom Riders contingent. Right. But go to the next slide, if you will. Max Pavicic, who's also come, he always comes to our MLK event. He's come and talked to our students. Max lives in Portland. Max gifted me with the trial transcript of his trial as a Freedom Rider. And this transcript is pretty much identical to probably everybody else's transcript. That's Captain Ray on the right. One thing, it was interesting, all the Freedom Riders, all, if you will, kind of liked Captain Ray. He was very civil, he was polite, he never beat anybody, he was professional. And so they always kind of had, and he and Medgar Evers actually had a decent relationship. But he was always at the station for the arrest. And this is him on the witness stand. and he's being examined by the prosecutor. He says, this is to Captain Ray, when this defendant, Max, and his group entered the terminal, he said, the circumstances in the terminal changed, and at that time I felt it was necessary to order the defendant and his group to move on. I gave that order twice, and when they didn't, I arrested him. And Captain Ray, were there people in the terminal other those of whom you arrested? Yes. I'd say about 20 or 30 people. State to the court whether or not you had an occasion to observe the mood of the crowd of the people that was in the terminal at that time. I did. Did you form an opinion as to the mood of that crowd? I did. What is your opinion? They were in an ugly or angry mood. Now state to the court whether or not the conditions under which this defendant was arrested were such that a breach of peace might have been occasioned thereby. Oh, yes, sir. Well, thank you. Now, under cross-examination, he says, when the circumstance, says, what happened when the defendant came into the station? After the defendant and his group entered? That's right. That's when the circumstances in there changed. Prior to his arrival, everything was peaceful and normal. After this defendant entered, the moods of the people changed in that they became in an ugly mood. Some of them moved towards this defendant. Police stepped in between some of them. At that time, I felt it was necessary to order this defendant to move on and move out of the terminal. Now, what was the defendant doing at that time? He was just standing there. So you're saying his presence caused the trouble. Then the question was, other than his presence, he did nothing? Other than that, no. But because Max was standing there and upsetting White Jackson, he gets arrested and spends 40 days in the Parchman Penitentiary. And the question is that, you know, is that the path we want to go on when we start talking about somebody who's, I mean, Nazis would offend me. It would be nice if there were police in between me and the Nazis. Nothing would happen then, for sure. But do I get to hit that Nazi, or does that Nazi have to be arrested because I want to hit him? That's what this boils down to. Let's go to the next slide. And so this is, thank you, T.S. Eliot, this is how the world will end, not with a bang, but a whimper. Basically, the ACLU kept winning. Skokie kept losing. But when the time finally came, after about 13 months, that the Nazis were going to finally get to march in Skokie, Dave Goldberger basically goes to his client, Mr. Collin, and says, try to keep this nice and clean, family-friendly. They're going to whoop your butt. You can't count on the Skokie police to keep you safe, because they're going to outnumber you about 5 or 10 to 1, and they don't like you, and they're not going to be nice. And at that point, Frank Collin had a opportunity to reconsider his whole concept of where he was going to march. And unbeknownst to both Collin and Goldberger, the city of Skokie had reached out to the Community Relations Service of the Department of Justice. That's the part of the Department of Justice. They're a wonderful part of the department. They basically come in and try to solve problems. Get everybody, they are I'm going to call them the Rodney King part of the Department of Justice. Can't we all just get along? And they brokered a deal between Collin and the Nazis and Skokie and the city of Chicago. And instead of marching in Skokie, Collin gets to take his 30 yahoos into downtown Chicago, where there's about 1,000 cops defending him from all the angry participants. You can see the JDL sans helmets are marching as part of the opposition, and they just kind of fade. Let's go to the, now, we can't see out in TV land how many people are going to raise their hands, but of the people here in the auditorium, in the chapel, how many have ever seen the movie The Blues Brothers? If you remember, oh, Susan, we've got to work on you. What can I say? And you're our chairperson? All right. Rabbi, how did that happen? I don't know. I'm not responsible. Okay. Well, if you remember the Nazis from the Blues Brothers, they end up sailing into eternity. Let's go to our last slide about Skokie. This was the end of the Nazis from the Blues Brothers, and it's sort of fitting because Frank Collin, remember, you know, this whole Jewish father thing? Well, the rest of his group finally decided we got to get rid of him. They actually figured out that he was a pedophile, and they turned him into the cops. He ended up going to prison for 7 years for molesting boys. He eventually goes out and becomes like in the astral world and just kind of disappears, kind of like Henry Gibson does. And that's the end of the Skokie story. The Nazis never marched in Skokie. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't know that. They actually never marched in Skokie. And so in that sense, the people of Skokie won. And what was probably the best result for the people of Skokie, and for this country as a whole, is they ended up creating one of the great Holocaust museums in the United States of America, in Skokie, which the next time I go to Chicago, now I'm going to go visit. But they paid a lot of money to their lawyers, but they did keep the Nazis out. So let's go to the next slide. So now we're going to Charlottesville because there's just not enough hate in the world. We got to spread some to Virginia. Rabbi knows my good friend Daryl Dixon, who often, has sung at Temple, been at Temple, and I remember Daryl calling me up when, and Daryl's an African American, lives in Atlanta, and is a wonderful diversity leader. He said, Ron, what is this whole Jews will not replace us thing? I don't get it. There just aren't that many of you. And you're right. We're not going to replace them. There's not enough of us. But they think we are. All right, let's go to the next slide. So this is about the lost cause. Just out of curiosity, again, we can't do a poll out on TV land, but amongst those here in the crowd, how many of you think slavery had something to do with the Civil War? All right. You would not be welcome in some of these organizations in Virginia. It was about states' rights. They should have won. The South's going to rise again. And gee, Robert E. Lee was a great guy. And now there are some people that don't think that way. People think, Robert E. Lee, he'd been the commandant of West Point. He'd taken an oath to uphold the Constitution, and then he went over to the other side. Maybe we shouldn't have statues for him. And I have one person here who I know has lived a long part of their life in Richmond, and that is the South. There are people with very, good hearts who just don't want to let go of what happened back then. And so the statue of Robert E. Lee is a real sore point. Well, in the city of Charlottesville, there was a whole new conversation in this country after the murders at Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina, when Dylan Roof killed 9 parishioners after a Bible study class. And all throughout the South, people started to reconsider this notion of statues towards the folks who led the rebellion against the United States. And in Charlottesville, the decision was made to first rename the park where the Lee statue was from Lee Park to Emancipation Park. And then they thought, well, let's get rid of Robert E. Lee and Traveler all at the same time. So let's go to the next slide. That didn't sit well with a group of folks who wanted to protest the removal of the statue and just protest in general. And so they sought a permit from Charlottesville to be able to hold a march that would go into Emancipation Park and protest the removal of the statue. There was going to be counter demonstrations in a park about 2 blocks away, and the city allowed the counter demonstrations 2 blocks away. And the deal is, if you went into if somebody has a parade in the park, then you don't need a permit to actually just stand on the side and say, we don't like you. So those folks didn't need a permit for that. Well, the city of Charlottesville kind of freaked out. This could be awful for our city. And they wanted to move that march of the white supremacists, and these were avowed white supremacist groups. It's a long list, which I'm not going to go through here, but there's there are battlefield reenactors, and then there are the ones that wear the really weird T-shirts, and this is the weird T-shirt group. These were definite white supremacists. A whole bunch of organizations. They're the ones that want to go into the park and protest the removal. And the city council, against the advice of their lawyers, said, you know what? Let's have them move about a mile away. We'll let them have a parade at a different park, but it's going to be about a mile away from Robert E. Lee. Oh, and those counter demonstrations that we let be like 2 blocks from Robert E. Lee, we'll let them stay there. And so they go into federal court, and the federal judge says, wait a second. You're going to let the counter demonstrators stay essentially right near the focus of what this is all about. But the folks who don't want you to take the statue down, you're going to move them a mile away. That's discrimination on the basis of content. And that's not going to be acceptable. You have to let them march. And the city goes, and that's about all they do, as we'll find out. So let's go to the next slide. So you can tell which side the Lost Cause folks are. The Confederate flags are a pretty good giveaway, and the other flags that are sort of like white nationalists. And they're going that way. The folks coming this way, you fascists are scum. They're probably the counter demonstrators. So pick a side. Let's go to the next slide. Where are the police? The 2 sides are going like that. Go to the next slide. Where are the police? You've got the weird T-shirt guys here and the Black Lives Matter guys there. I don't see any police in between. Let's go to the next slide. And this is when it turns from farce to tragedy. This is when Heather Heyer is going to die. When Alex Fields rams his car, the white supremacist Alex Fields rams his car into the crowd. Apparently, just before, the night before, his mother he'd driven from Ohio, his mother had sent him a message, be careful, and he responded, we're not the ones that have to be careful. It goes a long way towards showing intent. Let's go to the next slide. This is Governor Terry McAuliffe. His response the next day was to say the police did a magnificent job. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to let you fill in the caption. Katrina, George W. Bush, and Michael Brown. Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job. It was about that accurate. Well, City of Charlottesville did the right thing, and they said, you know, maybe we need to have ourselves investigated. Let's go to the next slide. This is Timothy Heaphy. He had been the United States Attorney for the Western District of Virginia, and then he went back into private practice, and they hired him, the City of Charlottesville hired him to do a report. And remember, the governor had said the police had done a magnificent job. This is what Heaphy found. He said, law enforcement failed to break up fights or take an active role in preventing fights and were instructed not to intervene except in cases of extreme violence. This decision represented a tremendous tactical failure that has real and lasting consequences. Police supervisors devised a poorly conceived plan that under-equipped and misaligned hundreds of officers. Execution of that plan elevated officer safety over public safety. Charlottesville Police and Virginia State Police failed to operate under a unified command and did not even use the same radio channels. It was a complete and total law enforcement failure. And that's a pretty critical piece of this equation, this whole concept of, as a country, we make this commitment to this notion of the First Amendment, and we understand that it is, as a part of that whole concept, is opposing viewpoints, and it can get hot. And there is civic responsibility by governmental entities to create an environment where the First Amendment can be exercised and people don't get killed. By the way, when I saw this, when I did my little Google images search to find a picture of Heaphy, I realized I recognized him. I had no idea why I would have recognized him. And then I realized, I'm curious, does anybody here recognize him or know why you might? He's the chief investigator now for the January 6th committee, and he is the one who's asked many of the questions of witnesses when we've watched those video clips of witnesses being deposed. And that's why I recognized him. He's going to be out of a job soon, but I'm sure he'll find other employment. Let's go to our next slide. So that's it. The First Amendment lesson from Charlottesville is that when hate comes to town, separating the sides is essential. And Lord knows, we've been learning that lesson over and over and over again here in Portland, all during 2020 and 2021. And it is oftentimes, it's not a fair job for the police. A lot of times their job is tough. It's not necessarily fair, but that is their job, and that is the job of city leaders. If you're going to make the First Amendment, a real thing, where it can live up to Brandeis's concept. Let's go to the next slide. And it's going to get harder, because more and more states, unlike Oregon, are going to open carry. And these are two different, I'm not sure if these are the Oath Keepers or the 3%ers or which Yahoo group that is on the right. This is the Not Around Coalition for African Americans on the left. I don't want to be a police officer in between the two of them. But as long as states keep passing open carry laws, we are going to see more and more and more of this. That's just our reality. Let's go to the next slide. A legitimate question. Are we going down this path where the First Amendment becomes a suicide agreement? January 6th raised some interesting issues around that. Let's go to what's going to be the last slide. All I can tell you is maybe not. There are consequences still, apparently, for when you go beyond what the First Amendment allows you and you actually enter into a seditious conspiracy to try to overturn the United States of America because you don't like something. I've been waiting for this verdict. And this speaks to the extreme end of the First Amendment spectrum. But I do think we are in for a period of time as a country where we will be living in this extreme end of the First Amendment spectrum. In closing, I'm going to go back to the words of my cousin, if I can find them. Let's listen to him again. He doesn't know he's my cousin, but can we bring our country back to a place where this makes sense? Those who won our independence believe that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. That without free speech and assembly, discussion would be futile. The greatest menace to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of American government. They recognized the risks to which all human institutions are subject, but they knew that order cannot be secured merely through fear of punishment for its infraction, that it is hazardous to discourage thought, hope, and imagination, that fear breeds repression, that repression breeds hate, that hate menaces stable government, that the path of safety lies in the opportunity to discuss freely supposed grievances and proposed remedies, and that the fitting remedy for evil counsels is good ones. And now it's question time. Madam Chairperson, how much time do we have for questions? Okay, so just for those of you folks who are out there, because it's live streaming and not Zooming, we don't have the chance to take questions from you, but we have some questions here in the audience. And now, Rabbi, is there a microphone that we can use? Oh, Susan, you're on it. Okay, you have a question right behind you. Sherry.
Hi. My question is about the. I'm sorry.
Yeah, just.
Can you hear me? About the Jewish Defense League. Is that the Meir Kahane Jewish Defense League that was involved in Skokie? Was that the same?
I don't think that, the question was, is the Jewish Defense League that was involved in Skokie the organization that Meir Kahane was involved in? And the answer is yes. I don't know that Rabbi Kahane was in Skokie. But Meir Kahane, I don't mean this Rabbi Kahane, but I don't think Meir Kahane himself was there. But yes, it was that organization that he started. And there were they were not at all afraid to tussle with the Nazis. First of all, they outnumbered them, and second of all, they were probably all in better shape for the most part. So sometimes they might at the different times in Chicago, they would rumble with the Nazis for sure. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, Tony.
Going to the Charlottesville one, I'm curious, in your opinion, if the city council had said, okay, the Nazis, you're a mile away, and the anti-Nazis, you're a mile away, pushed both of them away from the park, would that have been a prior restraint? Or, would that have been permissible under the law?
Okay. So the question is, if the city council, instead of just moving the Nazis, not the Nazis, the white supremacists a mile away but letting the counter demonstrations take place near the statue. If they had in fact moved everybody a mile away, would that have been considered prior restraint? I think they might have gotten away with that, because what they're basically, because their argument was, we need to keep people out of downtown. We have to keep the white supremacists out because we just can't have this kind of thing going on downtown. So if they had used that as their basic reasoning and then said, everybody go have your march a mile away, demonstrators, counter demonstrators, you know, they certainly could not have been accused of doing it based on content. It would have certainly enhanced their argument that this is just about trying to keep congestion out of downtown Charlottesville. That's how Portland. Yeah. Yeah. I think they would have had a better shot at it. It just had too much of a ring of content, of restraint based on content. Yeah, on behalf of the legal profession, the lessons of both Skokie and Charlottesville is listen to your lawyers. They know what they're talking about. Especially government lawyers. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate it. This is a fun talk to you. Susan?
Thanks, Ron. Thank you, Ron. Always informative and thought-provoking, and we're grateful for all of your talents, including the singing. So we have some more programs coming up around this theme of free speech. The next one is on February 2nd, and it's about social media and free speech and how we're going to have a panel of teens, kids from our congregation, our religious school, and we want to find out how they constrain their language or don't when they're on social media. And what is the impact of moderated forums also in how much and how you express yourself in social media. March 9th, we have a climate of self-censorship with Senator Rob Wagner. He is the Oregon Senate Majority Leader, and he used to be on the school board in Lake Oswego and has been through a few issues concerning how we teach uncomfortable topics in our school systems. And the final one is April 13th on Jewish values. Rabbi Kahana is going to lead that one. There are handouts in the hallway with more description and dates, because we're not going to remember them all. And I want to close by reminding you that this Sunday at 5 o'clock in the main sanctuary, we have a wonderful concert, Nefesh Mountain Bluegrass, Jewish Bluegrass. We'll find out what that is, but it sounds like it's going to be a lot of fun. So thank you all again, and thank you, Ron.
When Ron's going, he's always got something.
Good.
ACLU took a huge financial hit after Skokie.
Yeah, that I
It took years to recover.
I know we have members of this congregation. And they did the right thing. It was a hard thing, but it was the right thing. And they won. They won everything.
Did you ever listen to that Andrew called Andrew? He has one on being loyal versus doing the right thing.
Anything you want to know about this.
Anyway,
We're gonna visit.
thank you for inviting me. Okay,
Take care. So,
Pleasure.
I wanted you to meet this guy. This is trouble. This is River City.
I was just telling him that, you know, DeSantis, you showed this picture.
Yeah.
I just learned a few days ago, or 4 days ago, that he was a Jaguar in Guantanamo.
Yeah.
And he was the guy who justifies everything, and he may become our next president. Who knows? Yeah. Not only that, in Fallujah, he was legalizing everything, even though after it happened, he would write up how it was legitimate, all the things.
I was very intentional in using it.
Yeah, I know, I was kind of like, you know. That makes sense.
That was an interesting case, because it's like, you know, the government talking about the same school.
Yeah.
That's a whole other animal.
I mean, you know, we're gonna really.
I think we already know what they're doing.
I'm afraid of the answer.
And it's part of this long-time conservative sense that their rights have been suppressed.
I at times think like, even the prophecies say this, and I think there will be a day that we should be quiet. It's very sad if I see that when I come to shut my mouth and not say anything, and I'm always been vocal. And maybe even fitting that it is a tragedy. Yeah. I agree.
And the government should protect our rights to protest.
There was times during even during Trump times, I considered just laying low and shutting my mouth. I really did. I kind of, you know, trauma does that to you.
Yeah.
Kind of want to let go. And I really like that. It was very un-American.
I agree, it isn't.
It's actually a form of trauma. Because once you internalize that junk into the conversation, inside of it, you
Especially when you see people walking around with Mayor 15 the more so.
May God help us.
Takes a lot of
Yeah. May the man help us. Hashem help us with what's coming. We don't know the future, how it's going.
We know what we have to do.
That's right.
That's
That's right. What we have to do, a lot of times, is what prophets are about to very harsh. The reality is that they face criticism from both sides, from this mile away, from that mile away.
It's like the guy, Daryl Davis, he's like a black dude, he friend KKK guys, go to their rallies,
Oh,
try to get them to take their roads off and leave, and he like got hundreds of them to leave just by being a nice guy to them.
right.
And having a neighborhood, basically.
You know, I think this, you know, as we were talking about, I was thinking of Antifa and the whole notion of, you know, punch a Nazi.
Yeah, basically
I
that.
don't know that that,
No, that's not the answer at all.
a caricature of themselves.
Exactly.
Their whole role is to be a caricature. And, you know, they're trying to find.
Can you give me a round? If I haven't answered your question, I'll talk my thoughts.
Yeah, it is. What you do is opposite of what you want to do.
It's like a lot of critical thinking, it's like, oh, I wrote this, everyone else is looking right.
You're covered. Maybe we got it.
Like Adam's right. Two other black guys, they were like race apologists, or like they like didn't identify as black, except they identified as something else that was hated black people.
Always fun. In any group, you're fun.
But it's like someone like that, I would love to.
Cullen, I mean, that's a great story.
Oh, it is. It's like hilarious. Well, and then the fact that that's what got his fellow Nazis to basically die in the mountains. I mean, you gotta get rid of this guy. We think he's Jewish.
But the, but that self-hatred, that's, which is what Mayor Collin talked about.
Yeah. I have used that one still.
That's what people know about the story.
Right.
I've not seen that.
I've not seen the whole movie, I've just seen clips of it. And,
It was made in the 70s.
yeah, but yeah, it's a great cast. You got Waller, Carl Reuters in there.
Carl Reuters?
Yeah. So what?
Have you watched it?
Or not watch the whole thing. I watched various clips of it.
If it's realistic, I don't mind watching it.
Yeah, no, it's realistic. It's realistic.
Not documentary.
It's not a documentary. No. But yeah, so I don't know. Skokie. I think it's called Skokie.
I mean, nice to meet you. Pleasure meeting you.
Yes. May crossing.
Undoubtedly, around this time.
One mile away.
See you later. Thanks, Juan.
You got it.
Well, considering this PowerPoint did not exist. Oh, wow, you did a good job. Is it available? Well, the sheet you just did. Please send it to me. I'd like to share it. My wife wanted to know. She just started feeding. I also have a yeah.
So that is complete.
So I want her to watch. She wanted it.
That